Hello everyone. So we are delighted to welcome you all to the Evidence Synthesis Ireland webinar series. So just by way of a brief introduction, Evidence Synthesis Ireland is an all-Ireland initiative funded by the Irish Health Research Board, as well as the Research and Development Division of the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland. So our aim is to build evidence synthesis knowledge, awareness and capacity on the island of Ireland. And we have a number of key activities for achieving that aim, and one of them is a monthly webinar on an evidence synthesis topic. And I should say at this point also that Evidence Synthesis Ireland also includes Colquhoun Ireland. So our host for today is Dr. Heather Colquhoun, who is an assistant professor in the Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy Department in the University of Toronto. So Heather is an implementation scientist with expertise in the identification, prioritization and closing of evidence to practice gaps in healthcare. She also studies the methodologies used to design and conduct and report scoping reviews. So this webinar will cover the current best practices for the conduct of scoping reviews, and scoping review steps will be reviewed, as will the current methodological guidance to support them. So we'll be introduced to studies that have assessed the quality of scoping reviews, as well as particular areas of conduct that are susceptible to poor quality. And Heather will also discuss the recent publication of reporting guidance for scoping reviews, along with giving us some tips based on the collective expertise of the network for which she is part of. So just before I hand over to Heather, just for attendees who want to ask a question during the presentation, if you can select the Q&A section on the bottom menu and type your question in there. So you can type that in during the presentation at any point, and then I will ask as many of your questions as time allows once the webinar has concluded. So with that, I'll now hand over to Heather. So thank you very much, Heather. Okay,
thank you. And just to check, Elaine, you guys can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect. Well, it's nice to meet everyone over the web, and thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk today about scoping reviews. I'm part of a group that's been trying to advance the methodology of scoping reviews for several years. So a lot of what I'm going to present today is sort of collective knowledge about this. I think our group and our large group of people that are working on this and interested in this have probably collectively conducted probably more than 100 scoping reviews. Our group, with the lead of Andrea Trico, has been developing the reporting guidance. I do a lot of teaching on scoping reviews and give actually quite a bit of scoping review advice to strangers that email me, to my graduate students, etc. But I'm sure there's also a lot of expertise in the room related to scoping, in this large room related to scoping reviews. So I'm really hoping that all of this is helpful to you as well, and really looking forward to having questions. One thing I think is that scoping reviews, there's certainly, we know much more about optimal methods now than even 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, but I think it's still not so much a moving target, but I do think we're sort of still continuing to kind of figure out what actually is a scoping review and what makes them unique. So, well, here we go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so obviously I'm going to talk a lot about scoping reviews, definition, defining features, a lot on the methods, best practices, tips. I will talk about the reporting guidance, and I will talk about scoping reviews that have been done. There's 2 that I've been involved in and that I've seen. So I think first, I think it's really worthwhile kind of grounding what we're talking about with respect to scoping reviews into what David Moore called the family of knowledge synthesis. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. He has this really nice editorial that he wrote called All in the Family. And it was the editorial that they published in David Moore's role as the editor of the journal Systematic Review, when they also, I can't remember how many years ago it was, maybe I'm going to say 2, although I could be wrong about that, when Systematic Review agreed to take scoping reviews to be published in the journal. That initially they wouldn't take scoping reviews, and so now they do. Although my understanding, unless this has changed, they will only take a scoping review for publication if you publish the protocol for the scoping review. I didn't double check that in the last couple of weeks, but up until recently, that has been the case. So we sort of published this really nice paper where it's talking about how there's all sorts of types of reviews, right? So there's the systematic review that a lot of us have been doing work on for a long time, that are questions of clinical effectiveness. There's the rapid review, which is also done systematically, where time is of the essence. The scoping review that we're going to be talking about today, that's more of an overview or a map of a field. There's something called an evidence map, which is a visual representation. Although I've seen a lot of scoping reviews that have an output that looks like an evidence map. I think there's a lot of crossover of these things. The realist review and living reviews that are perpetually updated, so they're always updated. So, and I think that all of these, you know, there's differences, but I think there's probably more similarities between all of these reviews. You know, I think the differences are scope, type of question you're asking, how you're synthesizing data, what your outputs look like. But in terms of sort of methods of screening and sources and extraction, et cetera, I think they actually have a lot more similar. So scoping review is sort of one of this group. These are the two definitions that I tend to use and like. I think one's sort of long and one's short. I think together they sort of work for me. So the scoping review or scoping study, there's certainly, even within our group, there's a group that would always call these scoping studies and not scoping reviews. It's a form of knowledge synthesis, addresses an exploratory research question aimed at mapping concepts, types of evidence, gaps in research related to a defined area or field, and it's done systematically. The shorter version, scoping reviews are used to map the concepts underpinning a research area and the main sources and types of evidence available. So I'm just, the chat, I guess, yeah, Elaine, you would unmute and talk to me if something was wrong, right? Okay, just the chat's popping up. Maybe other people have questions. I just want to make sure nothing's happening and I need to pay attention to something, so, okay. Yeah, so, but I do think that ultimately, I'm just, I think when the thing pops down, maybe there's a delay on getting my slides to go. There we go. I think there's just a delay on that. So ultimately, I think what distinguishes a scoping review is the kind of question you're asking. Often I've thought recently, I'm not even sure if scoping review is a thing. I mean, I think obviously it is, but I think it just really boils down to the kind of question you're asking. It's a broader research question aimed at mapping literature, investigating what has been done. I sort of see it as this sort of form of reconnaissance where you're describing a set of studies within a boundary. If you were asking if an intervention is effective or questions more about interventions, then I say you're not doing a scoping review, and I wouldn't be looking in that direction. This is something that I end up addressing a lot when people come in to talk to me about scoping reviews. It happens often that someone comes and talks to me, they want to do a scoping review, but they start talking about interventions and the types of interventions and whether those interventions are effective. And I think as soon as you're going in that direction, I think you need to take a really close look at what you really are trying to do. I'm not convinced yet in the scoping reviews that I've seen where people have reviewed various interventions and describing interventions, I'm not yet convinced of the contribution of doing that when you're talking about those interventions in the absence of effects. So I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but I think if you're really interested in interventions, you need to really sort of stop and think about which direction, systematic review versus scoping review. However, I think one of the things that's happened with scoping reviews is that there are certainly these gray areas that remain about the difference between a systematic review and a scoping review. And I'm not talking about systematic reviews of clinical effectiveness. So I think systematic reviews with a PICO question where you're saying, is this intervention effective for this group with these outcomes compared to X? Those are systematic reviews. I think that's really straightforward and clear. But there are also systematic reviews that we do that aren't about clinical effectiveness of an intervention that we're calling systematic reviews versus scoping reviews. So even for myself, many years ago, before I really did a lot of work on scoping reviews, I published what I called a systematic review. So it was a systematic review that looked at how theory was being used in trials of audit and feedback. So we looked at the 140 trials in the EPOC Cochrane Review on Audit and Feedback and looked at how theory was being used in those. We call it a systematic review. A year before that, or maybe the same year, I also published a scoping review. And this scoping review was looking at how our 3 theories commonly used in knowledge translation being applied in knowledge translation studies. And I call that a scoping review. So, the question remains why and what are the rationale between those two? And I don't know. I think actually about it quite a bit. Is it just because the systematic review, we actually included studies from a systematic review? And this was a part of a larger sort of study that was looking at updating the Cochrane Review. So is that why we call it a systematic review? So it's tricky, and I think that's where those gray areas remain. And I'm not sure I have a really good sort of sense of that just yet. Happy to have comments and questions related to that, because I think that what I've seen, I think it might get better with the reporting guidance, but I've certainly seen that journals have received so many scoping reviews and scoping reviews of dubious quality that they've stopped taking them. And I've had colleagues that have had that experience where they've done a very excellent scoping review and sent it to a journal, and the journal sent it right back and said, until there's reporting guidance, we're not even accepting these anymore because we're getting so many of them and so many of them are done poorly. So I think it's definitely worth continuing to sort out where these gray areas remain. There is a resource that the St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, affiliated with the University of Toronto, put out, this is on this slide, a resource that is sort of an algorithm, a series of questions that you can go to and say, okay, this is what I'm looking at, this is what my question is, what review is right for me out of all of the reviews. So it's not a terribly complex resource, but I do think it's very helpful as a start to be able to look at it. It sort of guides you through a series of questions and pops it at the end and tells you, based on what you inputted, we think this is the right review for you. So it's definitely worth looking at. So why do a scoping review? So the way scoping reviews are sort of described in the literature, one of the reasons is to determine the ability to conduct a systematic review. I have certainly seen a lot of, I've seen several scoping reviews that were done for this purpose. And most of the ones that I've seen, happy to take comments from anyone else that feels differently about this, but scoping reviews that have been done to determine if there's enough literature to conduct a systematic review. They do the scoping review, they end up concluding that there is, and then you move forward and you find the actual systematic review and discover that it's an empty review, that there actually wasn't enough to do a systematic review, which is interesting. So I'm not, again, convinced of there being a lot of value in doing a scoping review for this purpose. I feel that most people that are going to do a systematic review in an area, they know their area, and they know whether there's enough to do. And a lot of processes of doing systematic reviews, certainly for guideline development, you start with a scoping exercise to look at what's out there. And I'm not sure if all of the resource and time and effort that goes into doing a scoping review systematically, with the searching and the screening and the extraction and the duplicate and the consensus, is worth it to simply decide on whether or not to do a systematic review. So there are my thoughts on that. But I'd say most often scoping reviews are exercises in and of themselves. And I think there's a tremendous amount of value in scoping reviews, especially given the amount of literature that's being published on a daily basis. Reviews are just going to become so incredibly important. So they can be used to summarize and disseminate research findings, identify gaps, research gaps, or any other kind of gap in an area, make recommendations for future research, define boundaries of a field, map a body of literature with relevance to several concepts. So that's why you do a scoping review. And here's 3 scoping review questions from actual studies. And I think when you look at these, you can sort of, more and more appreciate what the scoping review is really about. So what is known from the literature about parents' actions, challenges, and needs while enabling participation in their children? What are the extent, range, and nature of how 3 theories are being applied in implementation science? To what extent has the public been involved in healthcare priority setting, and how has it been done? So, you know, as we sort of start to pull this together, I think it's easy to get a really sort of better and better sense of what these reviews are and what they're about. Various labels are being used for them, and I'll present some data about actual rates of how these different labels are being used. Generally speaking, we're calling them scoping reviews and scoping studies. It's interesting to talk to the people in my group that are going to use the term scoping study. And I think some of that comes from Arkski and O'Malley's, which is one of the methods papers for scoping reviews, proposal of using a 6 optional consultation stage. So, you know, you do your review and then you do primary data collection with a group to contextualize what you found. And certainly you can imagine that that brings it much more into the scoping study if we want to look at it that way. It does present, I know, some problems with respect to doing this with graduate students. So I've quite a bit of experience in the last few years with the graduate division where I am at the University of Toronto. One of the things students can do for their comprehensive evaluation is a scoping review. So I know that one of the things about doing that optional stage is that you have to go through ethics. So you go through ethics and it becomes a little study that is actually on top of the review, which creates timing issues related to doing that. So that's something to think about. I also know, this is from a Canadian context, but I'm not sure if it might be also in Ireland or in the UK, that I know people that have submitted grants to do scoping reviews to funding agencies, and when they've tacked on the study and the consultation stage, the grant has been sent back because they're saying it's not a review. You're doing primary data collection, so this has to go to a different granting call, which, as you can imagine, is very frustrating. So that's certainly something to watch out for. So these 5 references are, to my knowledge, the sort of methods papers on scoping reviews. There might be more that I'm not aware of, but these are sort of the 5 that I know of and that our team knows of. And ultimately, I think that if everyone just reads these 5 papers and essentially pays attention to what they're saying you should do, then you'll be okay with your scoping review. The first one is the new reporting guidance, which is very exciting to have out. The second one, the Arkski and O'Malley, I'm sure many of you know that, published in 2005. And it was sort of the first methods paper that came out for scoping reviews. Very, very popular, very helpful, really sort of needed, I think, at the time to sort of contextualize some of what a scoping review was and what the methods are. And then the Levac, Colquhoun, and O'Brien paper, we wrote this paper in response to the Arkski and O'Malley paper. The 3 of us had all done scoping reviews, Danielle Levac and I as PhD students, and Kelly O'Brien as a postdoctoral fellow. And you know, we sort of took to heart how in the Arkski and O'Malley paper, they said, this is the first paper, please build on this. And we thought, okay, well, that's what we'll do. So we kind of, the Arkski and O'Malley and the Levac paper are kind of meant to work together. We kind of took what they did and said, okay, let's add a little bit more detail to it. I remember at that time we were still PhD students, and when our paper was being reviewed by Implementation Science, they sent it to Lisa O'Malley as one of the reviewers. And of course, we all know this because Implementation Science is all open review. And so I remember being quite terrified of that still as a PhD student as to what was Lisa O'Malley going to say about our paper. But she was absolutely lovely. It was a wonderful first experience of having a paper reviewed that was open and non-anonymous, and so she was just lovely, and it was a real privilege to have her eyes on what we were doing and having her review and the changes to the paper. So that was great. In a sense, sort of that paper was endorsed a bit by Lisa. And then the Doubt paper did a similar thing. That group had some experiences using Arkski and O'Malley's framework and added some detail to it. And then the last one, the Peters one, is the Joanna Briggs guidance for scoping reviews. And it comes with a nice sort of supplement that's a summary. So that, I think, is where we sort of are now for important methods papers for scoping reviews. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the scoping review methods, but what I don't want to do is necessarily detail out methods for doing reviews systematically, or what we know of as the Cochrane Handbook. I'm pretty sure my audience is that you know that. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to go through the steps of the scoping review, like any systematic review or review done systematically, however we want to look at that. But I'm going to highlight the things that I think are particular to scoping reviews, and hopefully that's helpful. And highlight the things that we know we're not doing particularly well. So the first is about registration and protocol. So like any review, the scoping review is a rigorous, replicable, and extensive search of the international literature, like any high quality review. And I think this is really important. As I said, I think journals are getting inundated with these reviews that aren't particularly good. And so they're just deciding that scoping reviews are not done well. And I think we all have to play a role in trying to do that better. So we have to go into it thinking that. Prospero, where you might register your systematic review, will not accept, and I think still to this day won't register a scoping review. So what a lot of people on our team have been doing is just putting them on the Open Science Framework, which is just an open platform where you can put research. And so people have been, in a sense, registering them or publicly putting their protocol or their abstract up on the Open Science Framework as an alternative. Hopefully this might change. And I would recommend a published protocol. As I said, the journal Systematic Review will only accept your scoping review because you publish the protocol. And I think that the rationale for that is quite sound. When I have done a scoping review myself or helped others, when they've published a protocol, it's just a better scoping review. And that's because you've written down every single thing that you're going to do. It's gone through several edits and iterations, and it's gone to an external reviewer who's looked at it and said, oh, this part doesn't make any sense to me. Can you make it better? Then you've made it better. So I think some of the reasons to publish a protocol in the systematic review are also because of, stating what your primary outcome is going to be. So there's some reasons around that why you publish protocols for systematic reviews that don't necessarily apply to scoping reviews. But there's no question that having a protocol is going to make your scoping review better, and I think easier to get published in a higher quality journal. At the very least, you have to have a written methods plan. And maybe this group, that's everyone knows that, but especially for even anyone in this group that works with students, I do find that for whatever reason, the scoping review has got this sense that it's easier, and it's not actually, and that it can just be a little bit more loose, and it shouldn't be. So I have sort of a new rule that if someone emails me, either a researcher or a clinician, a trainee that wants to talk about their scoping review, I say, can you send me what you have for a protocol? Can you send me what you have written down about what you're going to do? And if they say, I don't have anything written down yet, I'll say, write a bunch of stuff down and then get back to me. Because once, as we all know, once you start actually writing down what you're going to do, you think, oh, forgot about that. Oh, I wasn't sure about that. Oh, that part isn't clear. So I think that's really, really important. And my last point for this is that I think that even just thinking about doing a scoping review, it's going to become more and more important to search for existing scoping reviews on the topic. I think 5, 7, 8 years ago, there weren't as many scoping reviews, and that probably wasn't as important, but I think it's going to become more and more important as more of these reviews are done, that you have to search for existing scoping reviews on the topic. And I've already had many instances where a group has gone full forward thinking they need to do a scoping review on something, and then halfway through they discover that, oh, someone already did this about 1.5 years ago. So that's going to become more important. Another thing that I think is different, can be different with scoping reviews, is the use of PICO. So some people are really good at this, and I've seen people do it before and use PICO, so as we all know, population intervention comparison and outcome, for their scoping review, because they find a way to redefine those terms to make that work. I've never been able to make that work. And that ultimately almost all scoping reviews will be easier to frame as PCC. And this is written up in more detail in the Joanna Briggs guidance. So it's a different mnemonic, so it looks at population, concept, and context. And you can think about that for the question of your scoping review. So who, obviously, is the population. The concept is the big what. So stroke recovery, education and diabetes, participation, and then the context is with what all the qualifiers. So a chronic phase versus an acute phase in the last 5 years, in the last 30 years, et cetera, in a community context or in a specific country, et cetera. So this PCC way to frame things I find extremely helpful and is definitely worth looking at. So one of the things with scoping reviews, when you're starting to write your review question and the objectives, which I see as sort of those smaller questions, and the purpose, is really important to be thinking about all three of these things. So one of the things with a systematic review is that the purpose is already inherent in what you're doing. So a systematic review of clinical effectiveness, the entire purpose is to say, should we be delivering this intervention or not? And so it's inherent in the systematic review that you're doing, but it's not inherent in scoping reviews. And what I've seen is a lot of reviews, and actually I'll admit something too, because I've run into this problem firsthand because I didn't think about this, is that you can have a very clear question that this aspect of the literature needs to be described. And you can have very clear objectives, and you can actually answer that question perfectly. But unless you had a really good sense of why it is that we need to do this, what exactly do you want to accomplish? How will this result advance the state of knowledge? What purpose will the findings serve? Why do we need to describe this? Then what ends up happening is you kind of end up not really knowing what to do with your results. It affects the outputs that you decide. What should they look like? And your synthesis is sort of part of this purpose. How should we pull all this together to meet our purpose? So I know this sort of, it does sound, you know, like, oh, of course you would know your purpose, but it's not always the case. So here I think is a really nice example. This is the references on the last slide for this. And this was a scoping review that had just this lovely question, objectives, and a purpose. And this seems very, very simple, but I think as we all know, it would have taken them a long time to get to this point. So what are the experiences and preferences of Bangladeshi patients and carers in gaining access to diabetes-related healthcare information and services? Then they have their 3 specific objectives: barriers and facilitators, preferred sources, levels of knowledge in the community, and the purpose, they wanted this greater understanding of these factors that can influence access, including identifying these barriers may lead to improved service delivery with the potential to improve the healthcare of patients. It's just a really nice package. So really think about that purpose. And the scoping review that I did, it was for my comps, for my PhD. It was the first one I ever did. And it was looking at how these 3 theories are used in knowledge translation. And I think for a PhD student, I did a fine job of answering that question, but I hadn't thought through why would we describe that? What are you going to do with that? What's the point of it? So when it came time to actually pull the results together and write the discussion, I was really stuck as to, try to contextualize what I had done and put it in the sense of a purpose. So this is, I think, quite an issue with scoping reviews and one to think about. Sources and search. I think in scoping reviews, we tend to see a broader variety of included designs and sources. And I think broad search strategies, now that can happen in a systematic review too. They are not always straightforward at all. But I think because we're looking at uncharted areas in scoping reviews, we tend to kind of have uncharted search terms too. So it's really common to have absolutely massive search retrievals in scoping reviews and need to limit scope. I'd say 70% of the questions that I get asked on help with on scoping reviews and in my trainees are, I've done this search, I've got my question, I know what I want to do, and this is just too massive. So I think we have to really think hard about how we limit scope in a scoping review, because it's the whole point, is that you have a broad scope. And what I think I've learned over the last few years is that no matter what you do, limiting scope means you have to give something up. And it's just sort of making a decision about what that's going to be. And it's best to limit scope according to your research question. So it's what I try to get all of my trainees to do, is not say we can't screen all of this because we don't have the resources. So that is a rationale. I'm not sure it should be the only rationale. And look at limiting scope according to how you're, a science type of rationale. Use your librarian. Librarians are amazing. Everything is getting so specialized now that I don't think I could exist without them. But think about other ways of limiting scope. So one of the things is looking at gray literature. So a lot of times in a scoping review, we look at gray literature. These searches are really time consuming. But if there's a large part of answering your scoping review question exists in the gray literature, then it's really hard to say, well, we're not going to search the gray literature then. But could you do something more targeted for the gray literature? Could you pick top databases or top websites, top programs to look on their websites? Like, is there a way to actually reduce the scope of the gray literature search to make it a little bit easier while still searching? Is there a way to, for example, you might say, well, we're not going to do reference list searching. But is there another alternative to say we're going to do a random sample of 5% of the included studies, and if we don't hit a certain threshold, then we won't do the rest of the reference list searching. So we sort of have a better rationale. We don't think we're going to find anything there. We tested 5%, we didn't find anything, therefore we're not going to do the rest of the reference list searching. And another thing, I tried to do this so many different ways, and it almost seems that reducing the scope requires you to lop off an objective. And I think we have to sort of think about whether or not we want to do a full scope of 2 objectives or do a shallow scope of 3. And that's really sort of what you're deciding, I think, when you look at that. And I think actually looking at fewer objectives, which might have an effect on the search strategy and those retrievals potentially. We could also look at extracting less potentially. A lot of the reviews that I'm involved in, we just like to get a whole bunch of stuff. It's never ending what our scientific inquiry is, and we think, oh, we want to know this, we want to know this. So instead of limiting the scope of the search, are there other ways like extracting less in the entire review to manage resource? And I don't know about fewer databases. I think that's probably a bad idea. And reducing by date and study design, again, I haven't had a lot of luck doing that. If you say that the last 10 years is where most of the literature is, so that's what you're going to search, then if that's really true, when you limit by date, it doesn't have a massive effect on the retrieval. But I think this is certainly one area where I think I'm always interested in knowing how people do this. Inclusion, exclusion. Very time consuming, just like in systematic reviews, and done particularly poorly in scoping reviews. I certainly see a lot of, we included studies that were consistent with the research question, which is absolutely not good enough. And I think part of this is because scoping reviews tend to be about a concept. And that concept must be clearly defined. So that PCC, sometimes the context things I think are relatively straightforward, but that concept is usually something very big and very broad. And so that's really the thing I think that I would start with in terms of designing. I've just been involved in a scoping review that was looking at goal setting. And so there was just a ton of time spent on what do we mean by that? How can we parcel that out? Because the term goal setting is just too big and too broad to be able to look at. Screening, just like any review, best practice is 2 independent screeners. I certainly see that screening is often targeted because of resource limitations and reducing scope. So people will go to verifiers instead of independent screeners. Which I think is okay. It's so hard to do. Sometimes they're just, you have to make some decisions about what you are going to limit. I try to be really careful about going to verifiers. And because I think more often than not, a verifier looks at something and says, yep, that looks great to me, that's okay. And I would almost prefer for people to consider piloting 2 screeners on a random sample with an a priori threshold. I think that sort of is a better way to go. So we're going to do a 5%, 10% with our 2 screeners, and if we hit a certain kappa, then we're going to say everything's clear enough, our criteria are clear enough, and we're going to move forward with 1 screener. I think different people would feel differently about that, but I've tended to prefer to go in that direction. And one other point, I think people often, what I see happen is they go to 1 screener for title and abstract, and then say, okay, we're going to do 2 for full text. But what I've seen happen is that then people decide we're going to do title and abstract with one person, and we're going to be, you know, very liberal. We're going to say yes to it. You know, if we have any question at all, we're going to say yes. And then we end up with a much fuller list of full text. And so the savings in time gained from the title and abstract, you lose them again because you have so many full text that you're doing with 2 people. One of the things that is extremely helpful in making these kind of decisions is this nice paper that Andrea Trico led. That was it was based around rapid review methods. I'm sure some of you have seen this, but what they ended up doing is a survey, sort of a modified Delphi, where they got experts in knowledge synthesis to rank some choices about, okay, would you rather go to verification versus 2 screeners? What would you rather give up? If you had to give up 2 for title and abstract, 2 for full text, or 2 for extraction, what are you most and least comfortable with doing in the context of rapid reviews? But I think it's also very important for scoping reviews, and it provides a nice reference and some empirical evidence for the decisions that you might make in terms of what might be more or less impactful to cut corners on. Extraction. Specify every variable you want to extract, which is good practices. I certainly see that in scoping reviews that's not done as much. Some of the things to think about specific to scoping reviews is, will your extraction look different depending on the study design? You know, if you have randomized controlled trials and editorials in there, then what are you extracting, and how might you synthesize that given that it's coming from a very different source? I think it's worth thinking about where in the studies you will extract from, which is different from other types of reviews. If you're looking at how a concept is being reported or discussed in the literature, then it might matter whether that came from the results of an empirical study versus the introduction as a setup for a study versus the discussion. So I think that sometimes where actually in the study you're taking things from might become important in a scoping review. And lastly, the issue of quality assessment, which I'll put here. This is, I think, another sort of debate point. Scoping reviews have historically almost been defined by their lack of quality assessment or risk of bias assessment. And certainly in a systematic review, you do this for a different reason, but I'm not always convinced it's a great thing. I think that there are some scoping reviews where you might actually want to know the quality of the studies that you're summarizing. And I think this might change over time. I always think of this issue of deciding funding gaps. So you're going to sort of look at an area and say, well, we're doing a lot of research in this area, but we have none in this area. And so that's where funders need to put their effort. The problem I have with that is if all of the research is being done in a certain area, but it's of poor quality, then I see that as a gap too. And so I think that's just sort of something to think about. I think there are some reasons to do quality assessment in scoping reviews. And results in general, you tend to see in a scoping review a numerical summary and a narrative summary. Something specific to scoping reviews, I think, though, is to ensure that your synthesis is more than just a superficial summary of all the studies. So again, in systematic reviews, we have meta-analysis, and we have these very defined methods and approaches for how we put all of the studies together. And it's a little bit less so in scoping reviews. And I think what we tend to see a lot in them is, you know, someone has 15 studies included in the scoping review, and they say, okay, well, study 1 said this, and study 2 said this, and study 3 said that, and study 4 said that. And I think it's actually important in a scoping review that you're doing some kind of synthesis. It's not just a superficial one-by-one summary of all of the studies. There's some sort of form of synthesis to it. The Prisma flow diagram, very important in results. It's sort of a common language that we use to describe the flow of how we chose what we chose. And as you'll see in some of the data, we're not necessarily using those flow diagrams as much as we should. I think it's important to think about the outputs being consistent with the purpose. This goes back to this idea of this purpose. If we know the purpose for why we're doing the scoping review, then our outputs can actually sort of fit with that purpose. And I think we do tend to see more thematic analysis in scoping reviews, where sort of this idea of moving away from a superficial summary of all the studies one by one to somehow take them and try to group them in some sort of thematic kind of way. X% of them are generally about this. They're testing theory. X% of them are about measures. X% about or something. So I think you do see that much more often in a scoping review. And then the optional 6th stage in the consultation, I've talked about that in the beginning. I think it can be very, very helpful, especially for deciding research directions. If you can take the results of your scoping review and share it with varied stakeholders in the area to contextualize what you found to make a summary statement about where research should be done, I think is really, really powerful. And I think this is anytime I've been involved in this, I think it's just a really fabulous way to improve the scoping review. Just a few extra little things I thought of. I think a poor reason to do a scoping review is that you really think there's nothing out there, but you want to do a review to make sure. And I see this actually quite a bit. So the question becomes, is it worth doing all of that work in terms of your searching and your screening and your extraction when you know nothing's out there to come up with a review that only has one thing in it? So I hear that a lot, and I think that's a poor reason to do a scoping review, and also hard to get funding. You might sort of say, well, there's value in actually publishing something that says there's nothing out there. But I think then the question becomes, where's your time better spent? If there is nothing out there, and people that work in this field know there's nothing out there, is your time better spent on actually producing some work that would be something out there, or doing a very systematic approach to be able to say, yeah, there's nothing out there actually, and so we need to do something. So it's a question. As I talked about, another poor reason is to describe intervention studies in an area, but in the absence of any of their effects. The term, what is known about, I've used the term, so I'm criticizing myself here too, but I think I'd like to see us move away from that phrasing. What is known about X? It's not that it's wrong, but what I have found when people do that is it's unhelpful. That as soon as you say what is known about, it's like, well, what of that thing do you want to know? You don't want to know everything about that. There's very specific things you want to know. So even if you're using that phrase, what is known about literature in this area, you're still going to have to do so much work underneath that. And so I find that it can be an unhelpful phrase. And also, don't decide to do a scoping review first and then decide on the question. I see that an awful lot. People say, well, I want to do a scoping review, and now I'm trying to decide on what it is that I want to do. I think much better to get your question down and then decide what's the best review method for that question. And then just a few words on the reporting guidance. We are so excited to have this reporting guidance out. It's been many years in the making. I think probably everyone on the line knows how important reporting guidance is. One only needs to do one single review to realize how poorly things are reported and how helpful it is when people actually report things in a consistent manner. It goes on to help our systematic reviews, our searches, critical appraisal, transparency, completeness, etc. So incredibly important. So we now have an extension to Prisma for scoping reviews, Prisma Scoping Review. And here's the paper. There are 20 essential reporting items and 2 optional items. And it comes with an explanation document. So this is what it looks like. I think we've all seen reporting checklists, and it looks like any other checklist where you would look at each of the items in the areas and tell where you reported it on and on what page. There's just the link to Equator. Again, this is probably old news to this group, but fillable forms, fillable checklists, etc. are on the Equator network. And as well, Andrea Trico and Sharon Strauss's group out of St. Michael's Hospital have produced a bunch of reporting guidance resources, and these are really helpful. So there's an introductory video on the checklist and a series of tip sheets. So there's the link. You'll have access to that and be able to access any of those resources. And hopefully the reporting guidance continues to be helpful in terms of increasing the quality of scoping reviews. So there are 2 reviews conducted on the conduct and reporting of scoping reviews. So I'm going to just brush over them. This is one of them. We published this in 2016. It was a scoping review of scoping reviews. We found 494 scoping reviews, and this is current to July 2014. So just sort of a few interesting things about methods and our scoping review. So the first scoping review, and of course this search included all of the various terms that one might use for a scoping review, as well as the definition of scoping review that we use to say whether or not this is or isn't a scoping review. So the first one was published in 1999, which is interesting. So Arkski and O'Malley is 2005, but there's a scoping review or a review that fits that definition, first one in 1999. And up to 2014, with 45% of them published after 2012. So when you look at sort of a graph, they kind of go, there we know we're producing more and more of these. The number of studies in the scoping reviews ranged from 1 to 2,600, with an average of 118. 13% of the scoping reviews reported the use of a protocol. So that's even saying protocol available from the author. So that's pretty low. It would be really nice that we either publish our protocols or write a full protocol that we make available as an author, and that's clear in the paper. 36% use the 2 independent reviewers for selecting citations. 29% use 2 reviewers for full text. 30% 2 reviewers for data charting, and 43% used a predefined extraction form. So, you know, were reported that they used a predefined extraction form. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement here in terms of methods. In terms of the terminology used, about 75% of them use the term scoping review and 11% scoping study, and then various other terms. This is the word cloud from the TRICO study. So it's good to sort of see that we're, you know, converging around a term. It'll certainly make future knowledge synthesis easier. Then our group has also done, I work in rehabilitation, and so I think there's some even special things, there's special things about scoping reviews, and then there's special things about scoping reviews in rehabilitation. So we're doing a scoping review of rehabilitation scoping reviews. And this is the protocol. We published the protocol, and the actual paper is not published yet. I'm anticipating it's just gone back in for a review, a set of revisions to the paper. So hopefully in the next sort of 3 or 4 months, I can let Elaine know when that comes out. But some preliminary results. So we included the original scoping review of scoping reviews, parceled out what was rehab, and then updated the search. So we have 251 rehabilitation scoping reviews published up to July 2017. And some examples of methodological limitations in these were that about 40% did not actually use a method. So 40% didn't report that they used any form of a methods paper or a methodological framework, which was really disappointing. I hope to do better than that. 96% of them didn't include the appropriate flow diagram of any sort, the Prisma. So hopefully we can do better with that too. 8% didn't report any eligibility criteria. And so 8% isn't really the end of the world, but that's studies that didn't say anything about eligibility criteria, like it was not mentioned. It wasn't that they were poor, it was just they weren't there, which I think that I'd like to see that 0. And 57% did not report data extraction details. So those are certainly areas where we definitely need to do better. Similar to the all scoping reviews, but it's a little bit higher. 83% use the term scoping review, 4% scoping study, and then a whole myriad of terms for the remainder. Similar number of papers. The other one was 2,600. These ones ranged from 1 in the scoping review to about 1,800. And we had a median. So median was 35. So I think in rehabilitation, it might be that our scoping reviews have lower numbers. I'm not 100% sure, but it might point to that. And there was a lot of qualitative analysis done. So the development of themes on what was found was very, very common in rehabilitation. I think, I cannot remember, in all scoping reviews, it's much less than 44%. I think it's like 18. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to relook at it, but it's much lower. So in rehabilitation, we are doing a lot more of a qualitative approach to how we're synthesizing all of these studies. So lots of information there about how we're doing the methods and areas for improvement. And that was all I had planned to talk about. So thank you for your attention. And I think Elaine will go to questions. And there's also the references. You'll be able to get a copy of this so that you have all the links and everything. So yeah, really happy comments, questions, any experiences with scoping reviews. I'm always interested in what other people have done and solutions to things. So we'll just open it up.
Thanks so much, Heather. That was really fantastic, really interesting and honest and refreshing. So it was fantastic. And as someone who's currently wading my way through my first ever scoping review, very timely, very helpful. So we have a couple of questions already, and I guess while we're asking the first few questions, people can go ahead and just type in any other questions you might have into the Q&A section. So we do have about 10 or so, maybe a little bit more time for questions. So the first question, Heather, is from Jenny McSharry, who says, thanks for an excellent webinar. I had a question around identifying ongoing scoping reviews before starting on your own review. That often I use Prospero for systematic reviews, but that's not an option for scoping reviews. Is there a simple way to search OSF, for example, for scoping review protocols, or how do you manage that process before starting a scoping review?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for that question, Jenny. I have not tried to search on Open Science Framework. I do not believe it allows you to do that because it's kind of like it's almost like a big open text box, right? You have your own sort of file. And I think as far as I know, there isn't a way to do that. That'd be a great thing for Open Science Framework to incorporate into what they do, to be able to do that. So usually what I do is we just do a search. So I often sort of take like just your regular database search, taking those top, I'll tend to take those top most often used terms for scoping review and search on that. If time is of the essence, I will just search scoping study, scoping review. So yeah. And I think the one that often actually, to be honest with you, when I found all those other ones, it's a bit word of mouth too. Students talk to each other and say, oh, I think someone else, where I've seen it too is in military and first responders work, which has been a smaller group in rehabilitation and they know each other. And someone has sort of said, oh, didn't those students do a scoping review on X? Then they didn't publish it for a few years and then they did publish it. So that's usually what we do.
And really interesting, I guess, if people aren't publishing the protocols and can't get them on Prospero, then it's hard to then find the even protocol itself to start with.
Oh, exactly. And as you say, if it's in progress, you actually wouldn't know.
Yeah, which is definitely an area that probably should be explored.
Yeah.
There's another question from Anne Barrett, Heather, who says, many thanks for the presentation. As an alternative to what is known about, can you provide an example of a more specific question, please?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think, you could use the what is known about, but then you have to start to define that. So maybe what you would do is say, okay, so what is known about, theories used, I'll just say with theories used in knowledge translation. So then I start to think, okay, well, what do I mean by what is known about? So what I mean is, how are people reporting them? How are people applying them? How are they using them for intervention design? That type of thing. And then I would go back up to my what is known about and see if I could rephrase that in a way where I'm saying, what are the types, applications, and content or something of how theories are being applied. That wasn't perfect. But that is sort of what I would end up doing, so that in my question it's not what's known about, but it's sort of what are the types, what is, a lot of times in scoping reviews, we end up with this extent, range, and nature. What is the extent, range, and nature? Which is in the Arksky O'Malley paper, which has led me to sort of look up the definitions of extent and range, and they're actually defined very similarly. So it could be just sort of what is the range of applications, what is so start to kind of list out the specific things you want and see if they will congeal into 2 or 3 words. So it's what is, instead of the what is known about, is what are the X, and X of applying this.
Brilliant.
That's what I'd suggest.
Fantastic, Heather. Thanks so much. We have a question from Sumant Kagraj, so sorry for my mispronunciation of your name, who says, do we need to assess risk of bias in a scoping review? If so, which risk of bias tool do you suggest?
Yeah, so that's a big can of worms. Ultimately, you do not need, I would say ultimately no. unless there's a reason to do it. What I don't like is when people say, I'm not going to assess risk of bias or a form of quality assessment, and so therefore I'm doing a scoping review. It's sort of defined by what it not is. So I think we need to say, is there any, given the question I've asked, is there any value to looking at quality in some kind of way? So, you know, we might look at risk of bias in randomized controlled trials, but what ends up happening in scoping reviews, you tend to include very multiple designs. So I know I have a whole bunch of ways that we evaluate quality in cohort studies and quality in other types of studies, quasi-randomized studies, that type of thing. So where I've done this before, and I think it's on a review of, oh, it's not coming to me, but I used, what was it called? There's about 3 or 4 guides for assessing the quality of varied study designs. And I can't remember the name of them. If you actually give me an email, I can send you the ones that I have that look at somehow saying something about the quality. So hopefully that answered your question.
And I think your email address is on the webinar slides, isn't it, Heather?
Yeah, it's right there. Yeah.
Brilliant. And the webinar will be up on our website in due course.
Yeah.
So we have another question who asks, what do you think about revisiting a completed scoping review to repair the elements that do not meet current standards? So for example, publishing the protocol, extracting additional data and revising your conclusion.
Ooh, I mean, I think it's always a tough one. By the time we finish doing anything, we have learned so much from the very beginning. And I think this is almost a bit of a higher level fundamental kind of question, that once we finish something, we've done it and we've done the very best job that we can, and it's done. And then we move on to the next thing from there. If I got to the end of everything I did, whether it was a review or a study, and I said, oh, goodness me, you know what? I could have done this so much better. Then I'd go back to the beginning, I would do it better. And then I'd finish that and have the exact same idea in my head. Wow, you know, I could have done this so much better. So I would say no to that. I'd say take what you've learned, apply that to your next review, and leave that. And ultimately, this is something I've learned from David Mower, who I think is absolutely just brilliant. And I remember talking to him about something once, and about quality and, you know, design of reviews and stuff like that. And he said something, he goes, actually, you know, Heather, I don't care what you did. I really don't. Of course he does, because he's amazing. But he said, really, I don't care what you did. Just tell me what you did. In a completely transparent way, report that study to me, and then I'm going to read it and I'm going to decide how much stock I take in your results. And so sort of what I took from that is that if we have transparency and quality, that's absolute perfection. But if we have to choose, we choose transparency, right? Right? And I think that falls to your question. Just, you know what? You did what you did. Be 100% transparent about what you did, and then make it better the next time.
Really interesting, Heather. And we've another question from Aditya. So really good information on scoping reviews. Would like to know how to start with a scoping review or review in clinical research, in the clinical research field, and potential resources to get an idea of scoping review in that area, if you have.
Yeah. You know what? Start with that slide I have of those methods papers. I think they're all really good. I don't know if I'd start with the reporting guidance, because I think it's an application. Like, I think you need to learn other things first. I think I put that first on the slide because it's important and we just published it. But actually, I think I'd start with Arkskin O'Malley. To be honest with you, I'd read that paper and get this sort of idea about what this is and what it could look like. I think their paper is brilliant. And then I'd move on to the other papers from there. Because I think that you said the clinical studies areas, but I think everything about doing this in a good way applies. So I would read all of that, and then I would start pulling together a team. Get your librarian, content experts. It's not that different from a systematic review. Get your content people, get your methods people, get your library people, and start writing a protocol.
Brilliant. So we only have a couple of minutes left, so apologies if we don't get to all the questions, but you can follow up with Heather afterwards. Just maybe from Melanie Murphy, thanks a million for a very informative webinar. Quick question about refining the search. What's your opinion on adding a study filter instead of including all study designs? So for example, adding an RCT filter.
Yeah, of course, I mean, really, it depends on your question, which is always a cop-out of an answer, but it's absolutely the right answer. So if answering, you can find the answer to the question that you're asking in RCTs, then by all means do that, because it's one of the best filters, I think. I'm not a librarian, but I think one of the most accurate, well-functioning filters are, besides date and stuff like that, are randomized control trials. So it's a really effective filter, but it has to be that answering your question can be found just in randomized control trials.
Brilliant. And maybe one last question.
Sure.
If you don't mind, Heather, thanks so much.
No, that's fine, yeah.
It's from Sinead Hines, who says, thanks for that, very interesting. You mentioned that a larger number of rehab scoping reviews that thematically report their findings. Is there a preferred method of reporting the results once they have been extracted?
Yeah, no, there isn't. I think that in scoping reviews, you think about numerical and you think about sort of narrative. It might also depend on how many things you find. It's really hard with 3 things. That's, I think, when you end up having to go, well, thing 1 was this, thing 2 was this, thing 3 was this. It's really hard to avoid that with a really small sample. But I think there isn't a preferred way to do it. It really sort of goes back to the purpose of your review and the question you're asking, and sort of making sure that how you're pulling that together is in a way that sort of meets those needs of those outputs and that purpose.
Brilliant. So I guess, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We still do have a couple of questions. So, you know, if you're happy to follow up with Heather afterwards, if she has time to answer, thank you so much, Heather. It's been a really fantastic, really interesting presentation. One of our biggest ever webinars. So definitely lots of demand here for that. So we'll be putting the webinar recording up on our website as soon as we can. So that'll be at www.evidencesynthesisireland.ie. Keep an eye out for our monthly webinars. So as I say, we do these every month on a variety of different topics. And if you log onto our website as well and sign up to our newsletter, you'll get notification of all of those webinars and also the training events as well. And you can also follow us on Twitter at EvidSynIRL. So EvidSynIRL. And thanks very much to all of you.
Okay, thank you.